Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, November 26, 2025 in the U.S., the day before Thanksgiving. Professor John Mearsheimer will be here with us in just a minute on this. Is there a moral basis for American foreign policy? Is there a moral basis for the wars America starts? But first, this. History tells us every market eventually falls. Currencies collapse. And look at where we are now. 38 trillion in national debt. Stocks at record highs defying gravity. So what happens next? Groceries, gas, housing, everything's going up. And this dollar, it buys less every day. When the system breaks, your stocks won't save you and your dollars won't either. But one thing will: gold. I've said it on my show for years. Gold survives collapse. Central bankers know this and billionaires know it. That's why they're buying more. Is it too late to buy, or is it just the right time? Call my friends at Lear Capital to find out. Ask questions, get the free information. There's no pressure, and that's why I buy my gold and silver from Lear. And right now, you can get up to $20,000 in bonus metals with a qualified purchase. Call 800-511-4620 or go to LearJudgeNap.com today. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome here, my dear friend. We have had 7 shows today, the final of which is yours right now. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. We did manage to squeeze in 3 days this week what we normally do in 5. And part of that was due to your generosity. Before we get to the moral basis for foreign policy and the moral basis for war, you are, as is well known, a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and you were an officer in the Air Force. If a commander asked a person in the military to kill an unarmed, nonviolent, non-combatant, couldn't you argue that that was an illegal order?
It is an illegal order, period. End of story. And it would be an order that you should disobey.
So when these members of Congress made their statement, the 6 of them, 2 senators, 4 members of the House of Representatives, reminding members of the military that it is their duty to decline to obey an unlawful order, there was a legal and moral basis for them to make that statement, even though they're now being investigated by the FBI for God knows what.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these senators basically stated the obvious. And the reason that the Trump administration is so upset is because the Trump administration is executing military operations, such as shooting up these boats in the Caribbean that obviously are morally wrong. We've talked about this at great length, and it's quite clear that we're just engaged in wanton murder. And what these Congress people are saying is that that's unacceptable, it's wrong, and that service members should not execute those orders from the Trump administration. And you can imagine just how this enrages the Trump administration.
Right.
So in typical fashion, they're going after them.
The Secretary of Defense, who calls himself the Secretary of War, has put Senator Mark Kelly, who's a retired captain in the Navy, for those unfamiliar with these ranks, the equivalent of a colonel in the Air Force or the Army, on notice that he might be recalled to active duty so he can be court-martialed for his speech. There is, of course, a clause in the Constitution with which the Secretary of Defense ought to be familiar called the Incompatibility Clause, which prohibits members of Congress from serving active duty in the military. So Senator Kelly is safe from the clutches of the Department of Defense so long as he's in the United States Senate. But we'll see where this goes. And I don't know what basis there would be for the FBI to interrogate these members of Congress. If I were one of those members of Congress and the FBI came calling, I would say, do you have a subpoena or a warrant? And they would say no. And I would say, have a very nice day. Goodbye.
Sounds right to me. I mean,
Yeah.
even if this went into court, it's hard for me to imagine them losing. I mean, what are they going to convict Kelly of? Treason?
Well, the president says it's treason or it's sedition and they should be executed. Treason is, of course, providing aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime or waging war against the United States. That's off the table here. Sedition is encouraging a takeover of the government by force. That's off the table here. All these people did was state a truism, an accurate statement of the law, which is you are not to obey an unlawful order. And of course, the Secretary of Defense and the President are not happy with this. Is there a moral basis for American foreign policy?
Well, there's no question that American foreign policy almost always takes morality into account, but sometimes strategic calculations push in one direction and moral calculations push in the other direction. And in those cases, the strategic calculations almost always win. For example, in World War II, we allied the United States with the Soviet Union, which was run by Joseph Stalin. That was not the morally correct thing to do, obviously, but it made good strategic sense because we were up against Adolf Hitler, and we were willing to jump into bed with the devil if that was what was necessary to defeat Hitler. Now, taking that same case from a different angle, it was morally correct and strategically correct to go to war against Adolf Hitler. There's no question about that. It made good strategic sense and it made good moral sense. And by the way, you can make the same argument with regard to the first Gulf War. This is the war in 1991, where you could argue that we were strategically and morally and legally correct in waging that war against Saddam Hussein and throwing him out of Kuwait. You can make the argument that the second Gulf War in March 2003 was not a morally correct war. But the basic point here is that American policymakers always take into account moral considerations and strategic considerations. They weigh the two. And in some cases, the arrow points in the same direction. In other cases, the arrow points in opposite direction. And sadly, given the nature of international politics, in those cases where there's a conflict between the moral and the strategic invariably wins out.
Is there any moral basis for us giving $4 billion a year by contract, actually, signed by President Obama, to Israel, and then to fund Israel's genocide in Gaza?
No, absolutely not. I mean, this is a case. I mean, what we're doing here is we're supporting an apartheid state that's executing a genocide. That's obviously morally wrong in the extreme, but it also makes no strategic sense for the United States. Our relationship with Israel is not a smart relationship from a strategic point of view. If we had a smart relationship with Israel, we would treat it like a normal country. We would treat it the way we treat other countries, but we don't do that because of the power of the Israel lobby. So we find ourselves in this situation where we give unconditional support to a country that is an apartheid state and is executing a genocide.
So there isn't even a strategic advantage. Is there any advantage to the United States of America for the support we give to Israel? What does the United States gain from everything it gives to Israel?
Virtually nothing. The United States would be much better off if there was no Israel. Lots of people recognize that, but few will say it. The idea that Israel is a net asset to the United States is not a serious argument. We gain hardly anything from being allied with Israel. It causes us all sorts of strategic problems. And again, as I said, from a moral point of view, the idea of backing an apartheid state executing a genocide is abhorrent, at least to me.
Is there any moral basis for, we'll go back to where we started this conversation about the execution of people in fishing boats. Is there any moral basis for the president to have murdered, not directly, but through the Defense Department, 81 people on these speedboats, most of which were more than 1,000 miles from the United States?
Absolutely not. And as you've pointed out to me on the show, they claim to have a legal justification for what they're doing, but they won't show it to us. And once you hear that, you know that that legal justification would be sliced and diced if it was put out in the public arena.
This is the same office in the Justice Department that purported to give a legal justification to George W. Bush for torture and to Barack Obama for using drones to kill Americans not engaged in violence and never charged with a crime in Yemen. I don't know if it's the same human beings. It's probably not the same human beings, but it's the same office.
Yeah, same office.
I mean, you would think that they would put this out there for people like you and me and those of us that do this for a living to examine their so-called legal justification. Is there a moral basis for the president's threats to invade Venezuela? He has sent 18,000 troops to Puerto Rico, and he has a dozen ships, including the largest aircraft carrier on the planet, off the coast of Venezuela. According to our colleague, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the cost of moving those human beings and that equipment there exceeds $1 billion.
Well, I think the interesting question is not so much whether there's a moral case to be made. The question is whether there's a legal case to be made or a strategic necessity type of argument. I think there is no strategic reason for us to invade Venezuela. Venezuela simply does not represent a threat to the United States. And the threat inflation that the Trump administration is engaged in portraying Venezuela as this dangerous narco-terrorist state is laughable. And in terms of the legal basis for invading or attacking Venezuela, I believe quite firmly that there's no legal basis for doing it either. One only wonders what these people are thinking.
Was there I don't want to go too far back into history, but of course this is in the era when you and I were in college. Was there a legal, moral, or strategic basis for the United States to invade North Vietnam?
Well, we never invaded North Vietnam. What we did is we put troops in South Vietnam and we went to war against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong who were located in South Vietnam. Was there a strategic basis for doing that? Well, the administration had a strategic basis that they really believed in, which was the domino theory, which many people argued at the time was ridiculous. And nevertheless, a number of prominent policymakers, including President Johnson himself, believed in the domino theory. And we thought, therefore, it was strategically justified for us to intervene. In terms of whether there was a legal basis, we were basically invited in by the South Vietnamese government. So it wasn't like we were intervening in Vietnam the way we invaded Iraq in 2003. We went in to support the government in Saigon. You want to remember that in March of 1965, it's March 8th, 1965, when the first combat troops go into Vietnam. At that point in time, the South Vietnamese government is teetering on the brink. It's in desperate straits. And that, of course, is one of the reasons that Johnson sends in the Marines on March 8th. But anyway, the point is that the government in Saigon desperately wanted us to come in and pull their chestnuts out of the fire. And we went in, and we quickly realized that that was a Herculean task. And over the next couple of years, up until the Tet Offensive in 1968, we increased substantially the number of troops that we put in each month. And then the Tet Offensive happened, and we eventually got out.
Didn't the CIA have the president of South Vietnam assassinated? And didn't we lose about 52 or 55,000 troops?
Well, the Kennedy administration was involved in the overthrow of Diem. Diem was the president of Vietnam, and he was assassinated in 1963. I believe it was right before President Kennedy was assassinated. And after Diem was overthrown, we thought that what would happen is that his replacement would create more stability, and we wouldn't have to intervene militarily in South Vietnam. But the fact is, as bad as the situation was under Diem, it got worse with his successors. And that, of course, is why we eventually had to go in. But we were definitely involved in the coup/assassination of Diem. And then with regard to the number of troops that we lost in Vietnam, this is killed in action. I think the number is closer to 58,000.
Is there a moral basis for the $260 billion we have given to Ukraine?
Well, I think that we thought that the morally correct thing to do was to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. We thought that it was a morally correct thing to do to allow Ukraine to come into NATO and to be part of the West. I think you can make an argument that you can make a case that is a plausible argument, that was the morally correct thing to do. I think it was strategically foolish, and in the end, it proved disastrous for Ukraine. So I resent it greatly when people who favored pushing Ukraine into NATO and then favored pushing the war claim the moral high ground, because they might have thought they were morally correct in the beginning in pushing Ukraine down this road. But given the way it's turned out, it's a disaster for the Ukrainian people. And I think it's people like you and people like me who have been on the other side of this debate who now command the moral high ground. We argued that it was strategically foolish and in the end would not redound to Ukraine's benefit. So I think we occupy the strategic and the moral high ground. But I would not argue that the people who were in favor of bringing Ukraine into NATO and of prosecuting the war at the beginning were morally bankrupt or doing something that was morally wrong. They thought they were doing the right thing. It's just that they were strategically foolish.
Do you think it's possible for Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner? I suppose we could stop right there, given who they are. But do you think it's conceivable that they can come up with a proposal that will be accepted both by the Kremlin and by Zelensky's people?
No. As you know, Judge, I think you and I together would be a formidable tag team if President Trump asked the two of us to go to Moscow and to Kyiv and to try to work out a deal. We're two smart characters. We think strategically, and we do our level best to come up with a solution. But in the end, we would not come up with a solution because there is no solution here. If you look at the demands that the Russians make, and these are non-negotiable demands, and you look at the demands that the Ukrainians and the Europeans on the other side make, there's no way you can reconcile those demands. They're completely at odds with each other. So I just don't think there's any way that this war can be settled diplomatically. This is tragic, but That's just the way it is. And I think, as I've long argued, that it's going to be settled on the battlefield. And the end result is, even once it's settled on the battlefield, you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement after that. What you're going to get is a frozen conflict. And that frozen conflict will threaten to erupt again into a hot war, either in Ukraine or at some other place in Eastern Europe, somewhere down the road. So we're in deep trouble.
And this is a fool's errand, in my view, that Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner have been dispatched on. Now, where's the Secretary of State of the United States? Does President Trump and does President Putin, do they know that he wants the war to continue because of his neocon ideology, and therefore he's not involved in these negotiations?
It's very interesting. A number of pieces have now come out, including a big piece in the Wall Street Journal, on how the Trump administration came up with its original 28-point plan. And it's very clear from that article and from other articles I've read that what Trump did was he told Kushner and Witkoff, after their so-called success at getting a ceasefire in the Middle East, to turn their attention to Ukraine and to come up with a plan. So it was Witkoff and Kushner who were working actually with the Russians and the Ukrainians. I was actually quite surprised to see this. There were at least 2 conversations with Zelensky about this 28-point plan before it became public. And of course, they were talking to the Russians as well. And they're talking to people at the very top. So it was Kushner and Witkoff working with the Ukrainians, working with the Russians, who put together the plan. And what's very interesting is that Rubio had hardly anything to do with it. And it wasn't until the plan became public, this is the first 28-point plan, became public, that Rubio was sort of called in so that he could defend the plan. And he's been somewhat involved since then, but he had nothing to do with putting the plan together. My belief, and I have no evidence to support this, is that Trump kept him out and he's kept Kellogg out because he understands they would undermine any meaningful peace agreement. And
according to Colonel McGregor, Kellogg has been fired for that very reason, for fear that he would undermine any peace agreement. But there's not going to be any peace agreement for the reasons you've articulated. It is rationally inconceivable to put down on paper an agreement that would be accepted by Zelensky and the Kremlin.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the major demands of the Russians, and then you look at what the Ukrainians and the Europeans say about those demands, you realize in about 2 microseconds that there's just no way you can reconcile these different positions. And again, as I said, you and I, as smart as we are, we couldn't solve this problem.
Well, look at the track record of Messrs. Witkoff and Kushner. In the past week, the IDF has murdered more than 100 civilians in Gaza. In the past week, the IDF has attacked a residential neighborhood in Damascus, supposedly to kill Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. In the past week, the IDF won't allow an American surgeon, a specialist in bowel reconstruction, to enter Gaza to perform these surgeries on children. What kind of a ceasefire, what kind of a peace agreement is this?
There's no ceasefire here. Israel has attacked Lebanon over 1,000 times since the ceasefire went into effect last fall. This is the fall of 2024. They've attacked Lebanon over 1,000 times. Every day you read in the newspaper that they've killed a score or 2 of Palestinians. This is not a ceasefire in any meaningful way. It may be a ceasefire for Hezbollah or for Hamas, but it's not a ceasefire for the Israelis. And you see a similar situation in Syria. The Israelis are incredibly aggressive. It's just hard to believe. And they understand full well that they can do anything they want because the Trump administration is not going to protest. The lobby basically owns Trump. And if you look at people like Witkoff and Kushner, they have a passionate attachment for Israel. They're dedicated Zionists. They're not going to criticize Israel in any way. If anything, they're going to act as Israel's lawyers.
The United States ambassador to Israel is also a passionate Zionist, so passionate that he invited into the American embassy a spy who, according to Phil Giraldi and others, did more damage to American national security than any spy in American history. That would be Jonathan Pollard, whose prison term was commuted by Donald Trump.
Truly shocking. Truly shocking. I mean, much of what the Trump administration does is shocking, but there are few things that the Trump administration has done that compare to this. Why isn't this guy being summarily fired? I just don't understand it at all. Jonathan Pollard.
I mean, talk to the members of the American intelligence community. Now, when Pollard stole what he stole, which was the keys to the kingdom, it was the tools, as I understand it, to gain access to all of American spy technology. It was the Cold War. Where did some of this end up? In Moscow, to the Soviet Union. What happened when Pollard got off the Sheldon Adelson jet in Tel Aviv? He was greeted by a smiling, happy, embracing him Bibi Netanyahu, an American spy greeted by the Israelis. They probably laugh at us behind their backs. They spy on us, they kill our sailors, and we pay them.
Well, I think laugh is not the right word, or at least it's not the word I would use. I think they have contempt for us. I think they understand they basically own us, and they can do, I'm talking here about the Israelis and their supporters here in the United States. They can do virtually anything they want and get away with it. And this happens in so many realms. You want to remember that basically rich Jewish donors are responsible for getting 3 presidents fired of elite universities. You remember when there were the protests in the spring of 2024, a number of those rich donors moved in and they got the presidents of Harvard, Penn, and Columbia all fired. Really quite remarkable. The lobby just has awesome power. And Donald Trump likes to advertise the fact that he is America first. He's not America first. He's Israel first. He privileges Israel's interests over America's interests whenever the two are in conflict, which is actually quite often. And this is why so many people in the MAGA base are angry at him, because they understand full well that despite all his talk about America first, he's basically always willing to favor Israel over the United States.
He is bleeding support, and MAGA is bleeding support over this issue. The support for Israel amongst young people is way, way down into the teens. The poll numbers into the teens. I'm telling you, and the president should know this. Now, maybe he doesn't care because he's got Mrs. Adelson's money.
Well, he knows it and he cares, but the question is, what is he going to do? Right? He's between a rock and a hard place. This is the same problem that Vance faces. Vance wants to be president. Marco Rubio wants to be president. How are these two politicians going to negotiate this problem? If they're super pro-Israel, they're going to lose a lot of support down below, especially with the MAGA base. And if they are not super pro-Israel, the lobby will come after them. AIPAC will target them and go to great lengths to make sure they don't get elected. So this is a real problem for Republican politicians. But surprise of surprises, it's also a big problem for Democrats. Do you run on a pro-Israel platform if you're a Democrat? Do you sound like Chuck Schumer? Or do you begin to cut in the other direction and say you won't take AIPAC money and that you're an American firster, not an Israel firster. If you do
Well,
that,
we may find out how that plays out in the New York Democratic primary if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez challenges Senator Schumer.
yes, yes. I mean, the New York mayoral race is very important in this regard.
And very telling to the Democrats and to the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, the real problem, which you got at, is that if you look at how younger people think about Israel, what you discover is that they think differently about Israel than older people like us or people of our generation.
Right.
And the fact is that we're going to die off, and all those younger people are going to move up, and they're going to be more younger people born, and they're going to bring in more immigrants who are not sympathetic to Israel. And this is going to create huge problems for Israel and for the lobby. And they recognize that, and they're in overdrive trying to fix this problem. But in the age of social media, it's extremely hard to do that, as we are demonstrating right now with this show.
Professor Mearsheimer, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy.
After all we've just talked about, all the blood and guts and moral and immoral behavior, a happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. And again, thanks for accommodating my schedule today. I'm already looking forward to seeing you next week at your usual day and time.
Likewise, and happy Thanksgiving to you, Judge.
Thank you. All the best. So 2 specials coming up that I want to tell you about tomorrow, Thanksgiving Day, a Colonel Douglas McGregor marathon. You can OD on Colonel McGregor. You'll have 8 hours of his best work here on Judging Freedom, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, which is, if you're on the East Coast of the United States, just about when the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade starts. Watch us instead of the parade. And then on Monday, in addition to our regular Monday of Alistair Crook and Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern, we have a debate, which will be sponsored by Zero Hedge and by Judging Freedom, between Dinesh D'Souza and Dave Smith. And yours truly will be moderating the debate. Both sides have entrusted me to be fair and to ask tough questions of each of them. That is at 3 o'clock Eastern Time on Monday, December 1st. In the meantime, happy Thanksgiving, whether you're in the United States or not. Enjoy the next 4 days. All the best to you. Thank you for watching. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.